Good morning everyone and welcome to this, the fifth meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2014. Could I ask everyone to please make sure that the mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off. Our first agenda item is a decision on whether to take item 4, which is consideration of a draft letter to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in private. Do members of the committee agree? Yes. Okay, so we'll have that in private. That brings us to our second item of business today, which is an evidence session on the Scottish Welfare Fund. The Scottish Government published on the 11th of February the first official statistics on the Scottish Welfare Fund for April 1st to the 30th of September 2013. On the 14th of March, the Scottish Government published the responses to its consultation on the Draft Welfare Fund Scotland Bill, and members have been issued with the statistics and the responses to the consultation from those local authorities giving evidence today. This session provides us with an opportunity to explore with local authorities their experience of the fund to date and whether they feel there should be any changes made to the guidance provided by the Scottish Government. It is expected that the committee will be the lead committee on the Welfare Fund Scotland Bill when it is introduced later this year. So in order to have our roundtable discussion, I am delighted to be able to welcome our witnesses, who are Graham Ritchie, who is from Revenue and Benefits Service Manager at Angus Council, Ian Black, Director of Finance and Shared Services at East and Bartonshire Council, Morag Johnson, Assistant Director of Financial Services at Glasgow City Council, Stephen Devine, Scottish Welfare Fund Manager, North Lanarkshire Council, Leslie Rendell, Revenues Manager, Orkney Island Council, Lynn Brady, Revenues and Benefits Service Manager, Perth and Kinross Council, Gary Smith, Revenue and Benefits Manager, Scottish Borders Council, and Nicola Reid, Team Leader, Benefit Operations and Scottish Welfare Fund at West Lothian Council. So the roundtable format allows us just to sort of bounce issues around. If you want to ask questions, do so. If you just want to make comments on points that you brought or would like to bring to the committee's attention, or anything that you hear, we'll try and keep the discussion going as fluidly as possible. If you want to come in, just indicate to me and I'll make sure that we give everyone an opportunity to have their say. I've spoken to Stephen, who tells me that you haven't actually organised a lead, someone who wanted to go forward, so I'm going to be biased, and because Stephen's from North Lanarkshire and that's where I'm from, I'm going to ask Stephen to kick off. I attended a conference recently where there was a lot of ideas and issues bouncing around in respect of the way that the Scottish Welfare Fund is operating. So, Stephen, do you want to sort of give us an idea from your point of view, how it's going and any changes that you think might be necessary?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, to the committee for having us here today. Scottish Welfare Fund has been quite a steep learning curve, I think, for local authorities. The rather rapid process of change that's taken place to allow local authorities to deliver the service has been quite difficult in some circumstances, and in others it's been quite natural. The service, which was previously the social fund delivered by the DWP, was quite different. The awards that were delivered through the DWP obviously allowed for cash awards, and customers were used to that sort of behaviour. Now that the Council has taken on the remit for Scottish Welfare Fund across Scotland, the difficulties are the service is wholly different, and of course it's delivered slightly differently in 32 local authorities across the country. I think there's been a wee bit of difficulty in terms of the councils bedding in with the guidance from the get-go, and some of that's apparent from the first quarter's figures and the second quarter's figures. My own authority is among one of those authorities that has found it particularly challenging, given our high volume of customers pretty much from day one. I think there's been a real sense amongst the local authority officers in particular that the service is delivering really high quality positive outcomes for customers, but that presents a challenge as well. The sorts of outcomes that we're now providing are more holistic, they're more involved with the customer, where customers, for example, with community care grants are looking for furniture items as part of their claim, they're getting furniture items as opposed to cash. And that's a big change for the customer as well, and it's particularly challenging. With respect to the guidance itself has changed a couple of times, but most significantly in October. And that sort of loosened the kind of very tight, narrow bandings that some of the councils felt were attached to some of the descriptions and definitions within the guidance previously, particularly when it came to qualifying criteria for Scottish Welfare Fund. But now that that's been eased a bit and that councils are becoming a wee bit more comfortable with the discretionary element of Scottish Welfare Fund, it's been, like I say, a steep learning curve, but councils are getting there. And I think certainly my colleagues today will be able to give you some more evidence in relation to that. But I think that's
a helpful start. Is there anyone else got experiences that reflect that, or are they different in different authorities? Lynn, you want?
I can add that Perth and Kinross's experience reflects very closely what Stephen's described in North Lanarkshire Council, and the same challenges and the same really good outcomes as well for customers. We strive from prior to implementation to support Scottish Government's view to deliver a holistic service at first point of contact, and we're continuing to strive to do that. But it does come at a cost as well. It takes longer to actually deal with the case, etc., but the outcomes are certainly better, and it's a more preventative approach we're taking as well. With regards to the first 6 months experimental stats, Perth and Kinross concentrated in the first several months on dealing with our decision making, the confidence and upskilling our staff, so we actually delayed in inputting applications onto our system. So, for example, some of the information in the experimental stats, through no fault of statisticians, etc., are inaccurate. For example, it perhaps says that we took some time to process crisis grants, when in fact most of them are processed within the first couple of hours, but that's due to system timing, etc. It's been very challenging, but very encouraging, and some really good experiences for customers.
You wanted to comment?
Yeah, I think it's similar to my colleagues, but I think one of the issues we've probably all experienced as well, certainly in the first 6 months, was the relationship with the DWP, and just getting that, I suppose, the signposting between the DWP and the local authority correct. And I think what was established very early on was the expectation of local authorities, particularly in relation to crisis grants and the number of people that would be coming to us in relation to that, and those numbers didn't appear as we had anticipated, and I think a lot of that was due to the DWP and their processes for dealing with things like, for example, short-term benefit advances, and so a lot of the people who were coming to us actually should have been getting if you like, a payment from the DWP. I think in Glasgow's case that's, if you like, that's settled down, and we continue to have that dialogue with DWP. I think going forward, one of the challenges might be around the issue that's very current just now, which is sanctions. And I think the challenge for the Scottish Welfare Fund being administered by the local authority, and our need to protect people, who are in a crisis, but at the same time ensuring that we don't just simply move a problem, if you like, that's, if I could say, has been initiated with the DWP over to the local authority. So I think that probably will be one of our challenges going forward.
What we found in West Lothian is the IT system wasn't necessarily helping us an awful lot in the first 6 months, and we are only now getting a look at a system that's actually going to provide us with the stats going forward that we actually want to produce. Following on from what Morag says in relation to the DWP, I think local authorities are at a better advantage with this fund because we have more local support networks, and we can find out more about customers through social work, housing departments. We can refer them to various other organisations, which I think the DWP didn't have that at their fingertips previously. So providing a scheme at a local level is certainly helping customers get what they actually need, rather than just a payment.
When we had some information, we've been trying to get information. A lot of it up until now has been anecdotal about where people are finding out about the Scottish Welfare Fund, where they're being referred on by the Scottish Welfare Fund. We had around table discussion on food banks recently, and there was a concern expressed there that the food banks were kept out of the welfare system. They didn't become part of the system. But anecdotally, we've been hearing that people have been referred. People who've come for requests for grants to the Scottish Welfare Fund have been referred to food banks. How prevalent is that, Stephen?
Realistically, customers who apply to the fund in certain cases will not get a payment from the fund, and that's always been a feature where you have to make a decision, because the decision is effectively to award or not to award. And particularly from our own experience in North Lanarkshire, we have referred customers to food banks where we were unable to make them an award. Now, we still have to be able to be in a position of saying no to someone, and that's part of the system. The difficulty is, when is it right to refer to a food bank? Now, we've taken a rather pragmatic view of that, because food bank provision across North Lanarkshire is quite patchy. There's no one organisation that deals with all of the food banks, so it's actually fairly straightforward for our decision makers. If someone is turned down for a crisis award and there's a food bank which is available in their area on that day, then we'll refer them to the food bank for assistance. If there's no food bank available on that day, then we'll make an exception and we'll overturn the decision to make the award, because we won't see the person sitting without food as a means to get by. But we don't see a referral to a food bank as an alternative to a grant. The grant has to be in place first, and the decision has to be made on the grant first. So if you make that independently and you've made the decision as fair and appropriately as possible, then you can look at the food bank referral, and I think that's really how we've tended to evolve our practice from there.
Linda, you wanted to make a comment on that?
Yeah, it was just sort of on that point. Like has already been said, I too believe that the local link is so very important. But I'm interested in the discretionary element. Stephen saying how it was loosened up, the guidance was loosened up in October. So there's discretion there for councils. But I'm interested in how that translates within each individual council. Who then sets the guidelines at the sub-level that says to the officers, this is a discretion within which you can work? And do you get a feeling talking amongst yourselves at various fora that you're broadly all on the same page on that, or are there big differences?
Gary, you want to take a comment on that?
Yes, I think one of the strengths of the process that we've been through is that through meeting together through COSLA, we've been able to speak directly to the government and bring forward some of the issues that we've had. And typically we've had criteria where we as officers have seen that there's a need that we would like to fulfil, that it is reasonable to fulfil the need, but that didn't quite fit within the guidelines that we had already developed. And I think it's evident of the trust that has been put into the local authorities that the government was prepared to change that and to relax those. And I think partly that was in response to the low take-up and the fact that there was budget available, and we did want to utilise that. But I think one of the great strengths is that we were listened to as authorities, and given that trust to relax some of those definitions, and they were typically to do with people who we could see would have been entitled to a particular benefit if it were not that they were getting a different type of benefit. Or certainly the criteria relating to families, we could see that there was very definitely people who weren't strictly in the definition of a family, but a couple or a situation where there was some extreme circumstances, and that was relaxed. So I think that's what Stephen was referring to.
And do you think there is any degree of uniformity across authorities?
I think there is, but we've got very different demographics and very different solutions in terms of how we've chosen to deliver payments and deal with customers and that type of thing. So I think there is variety, but in terms of the decision making, we do discuss the types of cases, and some of what we see as grey areas. We sit down and we'll talk about those and learn from each other's experience. So I think in general, across the whole of Scotland, we are working to the same criteria.
That's good. That's one other little thing. At what level within authorities is the decision taken? What I'm trying to say is, are you very much left to senior officers to work these things out through experience of others and discussion, etc.? Or does it come from perhaps the Chief Executive's department or even the elected members as to what further guidance should be in place beyond that of the government?
Well, certainly I can speak from my own authority. No, it doesn't come from any higher than the officer level. That's where we deal with it.
Is that general? Yeah. Good.
Kevin.
I want to go back to a point that Morag made, convener, about the initial stages and the lack of signposting from the DWP to folks about the Scottish Welfare Fund. And you said that there was some improvement there. Would that be the same in every area, do you think? And since that improvement has happened, have you seen more folk coming in a higher take-up rate?
Ian, you looked as if you wanted to answer that.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose within East Dunbartonshire, we focused on trying to get as many agencies, statutory and voluntary, aware of the local authority role prior to implementation. I think we did well, and it was complemented by some of the Scottish Government's advertising at that time as well. In terms of the signpost thing, we work well with our local CAB, who we work in partnership with, and they provide our welfare rights service as well within the council, and we've got a network with NHS, local housing providers, etc. So I think signposting is important, and despite the work that we've done, that there inevitably are some vulnerable customers within communities who, quite frankly, do or could and do slip between some of the nets. And in that regard, what we've tried to do is to work with the police and other agencies who are maybe closer to the real crisis points. But I think our learning experience is, no matter how well we publicise the scheme, some people don't listen or forget about it, and we've really got to constantly keep on the case to publicise the arrangements.
Convener, if I can maybe turn that round in its head as well, and ask, are your staff trained enough to spot cases where maybe somebody isn't getting the right benefit from the DWP, and are you helping them through that process to make sure that they get what they're actually entitled to?
Michael, you wanted to come in?
All of our Scottish Welfare Fund officers have previously had a housing benefit, council tax benefit reduction background, and along with that comes the knowledge of welfare benefits as well. So our staff do have a rounding of what an applicant should be entitled to, and can refer on if they don't think that they are getting exactly what they need. The Scottish Welfare Fund is housed within our Revenues and Benefits Department, so in addition to that we've got access to the DHP, so we can make sure that they're getting everything that they're entitled to there, and we have welfare rights officers and money advice officers, etc. at our fingertips. So from our point of view, yes, our officers who are delivering this have got a reasonable rounding of what an applicant should be entitled to at the point of application.
Fortunate to have our welfare rights team sitting within our revenues and benefits team, and that is one of the strengths I think we'll have in terms of delivering the holistic service. And what it means is the officers that deliver Scottish Welfare Fund at first point of contact can carry out a full income and benefit health check to make sure that the person's getting all the income they're entitled to in the first place, to hopefully prevent them having to come back another time. And it does work really, really well. We've also got limited access in our welfare rights team to social work data. So in terms of understanding vulnerability and linking up with key workers, that's been exceptionally helpful. And we're getting a lot of support from our social workers. We'll have a mentor, for example, and it's helping us to learn new skills.
Ariel.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I wanted to raise an issue that I'm not entirely convinced that I see as controversial, but I know that some people have mentioned it in recent weeks, and that is the issue of vouchers and providing items rather than cash. And I would just be interested to hear views around the table of people who are, at the front line, what their authority tends to do, and the reasons behind that, just to get a better understanding of that issue.
Stephen, you want to take on?
In North Lanarkshire, if we look at crisis as opposed to community care, first of all, we made a decision quite early on not to go with the electronic payment cards and actually to pay cash. Now, part of that was so that the customer, when they received their award, received the value of their award. If you pay someone with an electronic payment card, then in all likelihood, if they're a vulnerable person who has someone else demanding cash from them, then the value of that payment card will reduce because they'll be selling it in the community in order to get the cash. So we made a decision quite early on to make sure that customers were awarded cash for crisis to negate some of that behaviour. In terms of community care, we have a furnishing service contract. We're now shortly moving to the national framework for furnishing. But we've provided furniture items from day one. The feedback we get is probably, as you've described, sketchy. From customers, in certain respects, we get really positive feedback because they're delighted with the items that they've got and it's helped them move on in their lives. From some customers who are used to getting cash, and this is a legacy from Social Fund, they wanted the money. They didn't want, the bed and the wardrobe that they told us they needed in the application. And so those customers are less happy. But professionals who support customers who are quite vulnerable have almost completely been upfront in telling us that they find it a very positive model because they're able then to provide the actual support that they're there to do when they're involved with the customer. So social workers, housing officers find the service very, very positive, particularly when it comes to customers who have addictions. What they don't want is someone getting a large payment of cash and then it's unpredictable in terms of how they'll dispose of the cash in terms of their need. And that presents a difficulty for frontline staff. But certainly any of the key staff that have been involved with vulnerable clients have been very, very positive about how we've delivered the service.
Morag and then Gary.
Yes, within Glasgow, from day one, we were able to put in place for community care grants a position where we provide goods. And I think we just took a view that just made sense to try and fulfil that requirement. We use our supported employment partner, Royal Strathclyde Blind Craft Industries. That was already set up and in place. So we were able to mobilise quite quickly. As far as crisis grants are concerned, we are still paying out cash, not directly. We use the post office and we're also looking to move to PayPoint soon. We have started considering if there's an alternative for food and seeing whether there is something we could do with supermarkets, but we're still looking at that just now. So I think certainly our position is very much if we can provide goods, then we will do so. We've not had any negative feedback from people other than I think just as Stephen has outlined, people who potentially in the past were used to getting goods. And we've had quite positive feedback about the quality of the goods that are being provided.
Gary?
We had a slightly different approach to most councils in that because we have a geographically diverse sort of area and low populations in a lot of areas, we didn't feel it was sensible to try and go down the line of expecting people to come and collect vouchers. So we use the mobile telephone network and we send a text SMS message which includes a number which can then be redeemed via PayPoint, so the individuals can get the payment within, in some cases, 10-15 minutes of the decision being made. And we felt that in trying to keep to the 2-day turnaround for fulfilling these, that was the best way for us. And I have to say that in terms of technology, it has worked really, really well for us. in terms of the traders and the network as well, it seems to have settled down, and that's our sort of route to fulfilment. So different from a lot of councils, but it seems to have been a wise decision to go down that route. In terms of our experience, we were slow to be able to fulfil by delivering furniture. It took us quite a while to negotiate that and get that through our procurement. And in the meantime, we did have 1 or 2 cases where we had supplied cash to people, rather large sums of cash that we then found had not been used for the purposes that had been supplied for. We moved to electronic payment cards and were able to track people's payments, in particular, and one client who decided to go on a spending spree in Glasgow, we were able to stop his card before he'd spent all of his money and get his social worker in touch with them and bring that to a positive outcome where otherwise it wouldn't have been. So that I think there's been a combination of different solutions that we've used depending on the person's circumstances.
Leslie, and then I'll come to Jamie.
Yes, I just want to give it from an island perspective, which is completely different from perhaps being on the mainland. Crisis grants, we've always paid in cash quite quickly. We worked out that the levels of cash payments are going to be quite low, and the immediacy of the payment meant that we just considered that. We did consider their options, but in reality it just turned out to be cash, and that's working quite well. As far as community care grants go, we only work with goods, but being an island authority, it's quite tricky if folks source goods from out with the island. So what we've concentrated on doing is having an informal discussion with the local suppliers. You can appreciate the number of suppliers that would provide goods are quite small on the islands. So what we do is we ask the client who's wanting to apply for the community care grant to source the goods themselves from the local suppliers. And we then have an agreement with the local suppliers that we'll take over the payment side of things then. And what we find is that distributes it equally amongst the local suppliers without preference, but it also gives us an ability to ensure that there's a local consistency of decision making. Being in a small authority, everybody's not quite connected to each other, but those that live in community care grants and crisis grants will speak to each other. And if we don't make consistent decisions, it's quite easy to get in a wee bit of mix-up. You know, folk come with false expectations. So when we're making a decision, as well as trying to be fair to the individual client, we're also aware of being consistent within the revised regulations. We always understood that the regulations from the start, it was clear from the initial training that we had prior to the scheme going live, was that they were just guidance. But the loosening of the actual guidance and the revising it really just confirmed that, and we've had no problems with that. We actually find it quite a good scheme. Being locally, we meet fairly frequently with what's called a Welfare Reform Committee. It involves the CAB, the DWP, social services. So it is different because we all know each other. We can speak and we can find out what's going wrong quite early on in the process. So
model for cooperative working, partnership working?
Yes, well, on the DWP, I mean, it's like everything else. It's just one citizens' advice office, one DWP office, and within the first few days, in fact, maybe even within the very first day, we had to liaise with the DWP very quickly on the short-term advance of benefits, and that problem is just sorted out, and within a week or so, that problem hardly arises now. It's well-oiled, and people know where to go.
Amy, you wanted to make a point?
That last comment by Leslie is very useful, because that's the area I want to explore, because I know Morag raised that issue as well, because we heard this some time ago, sort of anecdotally, that there was an issue with the DWP referring people to the Scottish Welfare Fund, where it would be more appropriate to have paid a benefits advance. And I think I heard Liz say that that's more or less sort of does rear its head now and again, so it'd be useful to hear, you know, is this totally sorted? Is this still somewhat an issue? And, you know, what's your sense of what's going on there? Is this just a sense of passing the buck by the DWP? Easier for them just to say, well, just go see the Scottish Welfare Fund?
I mean, I think, as I'd said previously, I think certainly in the early days it was something that raised its head. It was an issue, but we'd had the meetings before the start of the Scottish Welfare Fund. We'd made, if you like, the links, the relationships with the local DWP Job Centre Plus offices, we have our local liaison manager, you know, and they had, if you like, that daily contact almost with the Scottish Welfare Fund and when these issues were raised. I think certainly, if you like, the impression that I took was not necessarily one of a concerted effort with the DWP. I think it was just a bit like ourselves that were having to start working in, if you like, a new environment, and they're a big organisation with lots of staff to train, and I think, you know, certainly my view was it was a question of just getting that message out to their staff about how those types of queries should be dealt with going forward. Certainly my understanding is in Glasgow, if it is still an issue, it's one that comes up very rarely because we did resolve it at the beginning.
Do you want to make a comment on that?
Much the same in Angus, really. There was early meetings before the start of the Welfare Fund with the local job centre managers, and we had isolated incidents at the start, but it tended to be more down to, you know, individual members of the job centre not taking on board the guidance that would be given to deal with it themselves rather than passing it to us. And, you know, the local job centre managers have been very good in trying to resolve these issues. And I would say it's probably pretty much settled down now. It's just really isolated cases now and again.
Nicola.
I agree with colleagues there. There was issues in the beginning, but we have, I think all local authorities will be the same, we have regular meetings with our Job Centre Plus managers, and we try and iron out at that point in time if there are any issues. But key for us is that our staff can access the DWP system, so they can actually see why people have possibly been refused short-term benefit advances. So it's trying to make sure that those notes and everything are updated, so that if someone is coming to us, then we're not put backwards and forwards if they should get a short-term benefit advance. If the notes are clear, we can see exactly if that's not been the case and the reason why. So.
Sorry, I was buttoning because I wanted to ask you something specifically about that. A year ago and more, when we were first talking about this and other aspects of welfare reform, one of our concerns was to ensure that there was proper transfer of information between local authorities and the DWP. Do you feel that that has been a success, given what you said a second ago?
Yes, we have good links. We've got phone contact. We've got the note system on the CIS, Customer Information System. So all of those links and all of that information can be held on there. So from our point of view, we struggled in the beginning to make those links with our DWP staff, in particular Job Centre Plus managers, but those links are in place now, and we have regular meetings and we iron out anything at that particular time. So yes, there is good share of information between the two, from our point of view.
Stephen. I don't think we're alone in North Lanarkshire in possibly characterising the relationship with the DWP as initially challenging when it came to STBAs, but there's been a substantial improvement, not just in the relationship, but in terms of the number of referrals that we're getting from the DWP in relation to STBAs. But we're also beginning to see a more increased volume of customers coming who have either been sanctioned or have had an ESA medical where they've been found fit for work, or mandatory reconsiderations. So there are other issues with the DWP which are starting to build some of the traffic again in relation to, particularly, I don't want to suggest that the customers are problem customers, but the problem that they present to us becomes a problem, because then we need to quickly communicate with the DWP, and sometimes, despite having access to the CIS system, which is the DWP information system, the notes aren't always up to date. And to be fair on some of the staff at the DWP, sometimes they write in code because they abbreviate everything, and our staff are getting up to speed with not just the code that it's written in, if you like, the shorthand, but also how to interpret that from office to office. Absolutely. And there's a real difficulty for customers in that respect, because we need to try and fit them into our decision-making process, whilst being acutely aware that the DWP have them firmly within their decision-making process also.
Notwithstanding, I think there was a realisation that this was a new system, that there would be some teething problems, but I think there was still a sense of disappointment when the initial figures came out about the amount of money that was being distributed. we got an indication that of the £33 million which is available this year in the fund, the Scottish Government officials thought that by the end of this year, about £28 million would have been distributed. The figures that have come out this morning would indicate that there is going to be a shortfall. The trajectory has sort of gone forward as was expected, and that there will be a shortfall at the end of the year. So is there anything that you would recommend that would help to increase take-up? Lynn?
Maybe bucking the trend a little bit, but I think Perth and Kinross Council are likely to spend all the Scottish Welfare Fund money. In fact, over the last week, we've wired some money, just a small amount, from crisis grants to community care grants, which supports the Scottish Government's will initially to try and reduce crisis spend and get preventative work in place and increase community care. I think that is down to awareness and our good links with social workers, with schools, third sector and health colleagues and police as well. And we have had a concerted effort probably since about October to raise that awareness, and the applications are now coming in. And I have to agree as well what Stephen said in terms of sanctions and conditionality with DWP. I think that definitely is an emerging issue, and it will impact on the fund, I believe, going forward.
Linda, did you want to?
Yes, it's on the same point, so it ties in rather well, about the potential underspends this year, but I was thinking of it from the other point of view when we do consider sanctions and things that are likely to up that spend. Is there any view from your own local authorities about what happens if you run out of funds before the end of the financial year, any given year?
Graham, you want?
Yeah, sorry, it's more commenting on the spend figures. I mean, I think initially, we're revenues and benefits people who originally make decisions, house and benefits, all around regulations. It's very strict as to who you can pay and when you pay. We've went to someone we're completely inexperienced in, discretionary payments in the way of welfare fund and discretionary housing payments. And it's completely different. Our thoughts at the beginning were all about keeping priority levels high to make this budget last all year. And, the initial spending patterns compared to the spending patterns, the last 3 months are completely different. If you look at the set of figures to the end of September, and, I've got more up-to-date figures on a monthly basis, we're overspending our budget every month now. And that's because we've brought the priority level down to low. The demand in our area hasn't really changed. It's been quite consistent, I think. And I mean, I would have said that as far as our spend patterns go, probably from November onwards, give a much clearer indication of what we will spend in future. And we will spend our budget. We won't spend it for this year, but we will spend it at the rate we're going at, in 14-15.
Ian and then Murray.
I would echo Angus's experience. We started with a fairly cautious approach, conscious of a finite budget. And given the revenues and benefits background and the strictures that we typically have to work with within that area, we're conscious of that cash limit. So the initial criteria that we applied was only to high priority claimants. Very quickly, from June onwards, we applied it to high and medium. And from October onwards, we've been applying the criteria of high, medium and low, and that complemented by the revised guidance from Scottish Government, which colleagues have outlined has been quite helpful. We are now a profile where, although over the course of the year we anticipate being around £20,000 underspent, we expect to be at about 40,000 over in the community grants, and about 20,000 under in the crisis. Going forward, we're uncertain if we'll be able to award at high, medium and low for the entire financial year, given the uncertainties of what the relaxation and the sanctions environment is going to be. So we will be spending as much as possible on the appropriate cases this year, and going forward, that will bring another challenge, because we've got a similar environment, but a slight change to that. And that's probably been one of our most difficult areas, because the claimant numbers, the applications haven't changed. It's just been the awarding of that has been slightly easier over the latter part of the year.
Right.
I think similar in terms of the start of the year for Glasgow. You know, there was a lot of uncertainty. We thought we would be inundated with demand, so we started off very cautious. And actually, I think one of the issues that we recognised very quickly is the way that the staff had been trained. That kind of approach had been almost like drummed into the staff in their training. And I think it took us quite a long time to encourage the decision makers to be slightly less of a gatekeeper and really try and focus in. And I think, you know, that's no disrespect to the staff. I think that's just a recognition of that culture. So the position that Glasgow's in, and I think this is, you know, borne out by a lot of local authorities, is over the last 3 months of last year, we have overspent. We were then actually presented with the problem, well, you don't just want to move into the new financial year almost like completely cut off, you know, awarding low on the 31st of March and moving to high on the 1st of April. So what you're trying to do is almost like come in with like a soft, steady landing. I mean, you know, if we go back to the question about what if you overspend, well, I suppose the challenge for local authorities, like everything, is, well, if we overspend, that money has to come from somewhere else in our budget. We monitor this budget daily, actually. The Welfare Fund Manager, and I'm sure it's the same in other local authorities, knows what his daily spend needs to be, and we monitor the priority levels in that way. Our outturn is that we would expect to be, our budget is about 7.7 million, we would expect to be certainly around the 7.2, 7.3, but actually when you get to that level, that's about timing. You know, that's about you've ordered goods, but they're not delivered to the new year. So actually, I think if we land somewhere around the 96, 97% of our budget, in all intents and purposes, I think we've fully spent our budget.
And then Jamie.
I'm going to ask, really just follows directly on for this and covers some of the same ground. Looking at the projections for the whole of the year that we're coming to an end of, and the actual expenditure, of course, we've talked about how it was low initially, and there are a lot of start-up reasons for that. But what I wanted to explore was other reasons for that. And the first question I would like to ask people who actually know what they're talking about is there a natural seasonality to this? Is there an assumption that demand on the schemes may be lower April to September and higher September to April?
Yeah.
Well, as regards community care grants, first of all, we started out initially using local recycle projects. You know, and if you're comparing what we spend and what we pay for goods out of there compared to the DWP probably gave people money in the past to pay for things new. Although we're probably dealing with the same amount of applicants and paying the same amount of people, it costs a lot less for us to do that. We've subsequently moved to the National Framework Agreement. And again, when you look at the prices of individual items there, they're astonishingly low. It's quite bizarre, the price of the goods you can buy there compared to the normal council procurement system, because it's quite a contrast. Yeah, so that's got a lot to do with keeping our community care grant spend down, because we're using recycled goods and that national contract.
Do you expect in a normal year, one that doesn't have the start-up impact, would you expect to see demand higher in the winter months than in the summer months?
Yes, probably what I'd say as well is we've been very fortunate this winter in Angus, as you probably know. We've had a really mild winter. We haven't experienced snow, we haven't had these storms or storm damage, and the floods that they've had in other areas of the country. So we've spent quite a bit in the winter period on topping up people's electricity and power. But we'd expect in a normal harsh winter for that to go up quite a bit as well. So, you know, I'd probably be looking to start off, you know, have priority levels a wee bit higher in the summer and reduce them in the winter and help people more in the winter period. So I think there will be fluctuation through the year. Yeah.
So as we look forward to the period that, you know, the transition that happens at the end of this month, and into a new year, will that potential for variability of demand have been taken into account in projections for the subsequent year?
Yes, yes. We'll probably initially start off just at the same low priority level, and we'll raise it to medium through that summer period again, the June, July, August, September spell, when we shouldn't really be topping up very many people's electricity and power.
Yeah, it's an observation in terms of what will be expended out of the overall Scottish Welfare Fund. I mean, clearly we don't know how much will be spent, and we won't be able to assess that at the end of the financial year, and clearly we hope it will be, or as much of it will be spent in helping people as possible. If we take the £28 million figure that was posited, I'm pretty certain I remember looking right back at the start and looked at this convener that level of expenditure would be, I think, still slightly ahead of the expenditure that was in the equivalent schemes in previous years. And also, if local government and the Scottish Government together hadn't topped up the DWP funding, just as in Wales, where the Welsh Assembly haven't topped up the DWP funding, wouldn't even be able to reach that level. So that's just an observation which people can feel free to comment on if they want. But my question is, it goes back to something that Gary was talking about. Clearly there's a good relationship between local government and the Scottish Government through COSLA in terms of saying that guidance needs to be tweaked here and there, and we've seen guidance changed. But going forward, we know that the Scottish Welfare Fund is going to be put on a statutory footing. So how confident are you confident that the benefit of your experience will influence the formation of that legislation?
Stephen.
This is probably quite a dismissive answer in one respect, in the sense that the Social Fund was a 20-plus year mature service from the DWP, which was delivered through varying different economic times. We now find ourselves in the middle of a huge process of welfare reform, and we're introducing not a replacement for Social Fund, but an almost wholly new service which delivers wholly different outcomes. And the challenge for local authorities is that we'd dearly love to come and be able to give you a very clear picture about what demand will look like in 3 months' time, 6 months' time. The truth of the matter is we simply don't have the experience yet of the new service long enough. The figures that have been released into the public domain are the first 2 quarters, and that's effectively 26 weeks worth of stats, and we're comparing that like for like with a 20-year mature service. Now, I know that as my decision makers put in a shift every day in the office, they're gathering more experience, they're gathering more knowledge, and they're getting better outcomes for customers. And I think we'll be able to provide much better answers to your questions in relation to some of the demand issues and some of the budget issues, probably as we get another 12 months down the line. And that's why I say it sounds dismissive. It's not meant to be dismissive. It's just simply a bit of a reality check on the stats that have been produced thus far.
So can I just say, I don't find that a dismissive answer. I thought that's very helpful. But in terms of going forward, I suppose my first bit was more an observation. I'm more interested in the sense of putting this in a statutory footing and how the benefit of your experience can help inform that legislation. I mean, that's obviously going to be essential. You're the people delivering it on the ground.
I think it's been an excellent example of joined at work in so far. Prior to implementation with Scottish Government, COSLA, all the local authorities, and we really have moved forward together, and it looks like that, that's the intention, is to continue to do that. Those involved in putting the legislation together are listening to us, they're listening to experiences, they're coming out and visiting local authorities, and it really, really is making a difference. With regards to it becoming legislation and the duty sitting within a local authority, my own personal view is that whilst it is definitely coming at a cost to local authority, because the administration fund isn't covering administration of the scheme at the moment, especially in Perth and Kinross Council, I can only speak for that, but I think it's the right place for the fund to be. We can help customers. We're getting really, really good outcomes. It is holistic and it's not transactional like the previous fund was.
Annabelle, you want to?
I suppose in part picks up on a point that Lynn has just made, and I was going to ask, because we are coming up to looking at legislation, and I was going to ask in terms of the delivery model. So the Scottish Government's preference has clearly been for the delivery model to be through the local authorities. In other parts of the UK, that's not the case. Wales, for example, use a private sector company for delivery. They don't use local authorities. And I just wonder, in light of the fact legislation is coming up, is that your general feeling that you feel that the local authority is the best place to deliver on the ground in terms of the fund in Scotland.
Morag.
I think from a practical perspective, what we've heard today is that ability maybe for local authorities to take that more holistic approach. So I think in terms of going forward, from a practical perspective, it would make sense. I think the only, I suppose, caution about it going forward in statute is around the funding and what obligation local authorities will have going forward, because obviously at the moment the funding that is coming is, I think for all intents and purposes, ring-fenced. It's possibly not formally ring-fenced in the settlement, but that's effectively how it's been treated. And I think that's just the bit of uncertainty that local authorities will have in terms of what potential financial burden they might be taking on going forward.
Gary?
Yeah, I just kind of echo what my colleagues have said. I think there's a great strength in delivering it locally because we can tailor the delivery methods or mechanisms to the area that we're in. In terms of the way that we have worked together, I think I've said already that there has been a great strength in that, and I think the legislation, I welcome the guidance moving into legislation, but as Morag says, particularly from a small council's point of view, we are worried about the finance element of that. Just to give our example, we in what admin funding can afford 2 members of staff to deal with this. We're using 5. And I would imagine that all of my colleagues around the table have different numbers, but the same message coming across, that we are supplementing the admin side of this quite heavily.
I was going to come on to, because when we took evidence from local authorities about the administration of DHP, the figures that came out were quite staggering about the additional administrative costs. I mean, I don't know if you were going to comment on that, Ian, but you did want to come in on the discussion we were having.
I could replicate exactly the figures that Gary's quoting there. We were allocated funding for approximately 2 staff, and every day we have at least 5 on the Scottish Welfare Fund. That's a small authority, relatively affluent authority, but I'm pretty sure that sort of metric's common. That would probably be, I think, my concern going forward. Local authorities are well placed, if not uniquely placed, within the community planning partnership environment to be the central point for delivery of the welfare fund. But it has come at a cost. Within my own team, we prioritise the welfare fund applications and the processes, and that has undoubtedly been to the detriment of our core housing benefit, council tax reduction, DHP work, just because of the very nature of the crisis payments and the longer term resettlement arrangements that the community care grants have. We've had to make that value judgment, and you know, had we had more resources, we would have augmented that.
I'd be interested to see a sort of contrast between the bigger and the smaller authorities. Stephen, do you have an idea of the administrative?
We were resourced to the tune of just short of £500,000. Initially, we started with 16 staff, including myself. We're now up to 25 staff. But the challenge initially, I think, has been presented to councils not just to resource a model which was similar to Social Fund, because effectively councils were given an indication, you know, that you could make so many decisions in a day, therefore you would need so many staff to administer these decisions. But most of those calculations were based on delivering a Social Fund decision, and most of the councils have found that actually, as was described by Ian there, for community care grants in particular, you're having to do a whole lot more work after the fact. And even with crisis, when you're doing a whole lot more of the holistic work, you're referring on to people, it takes additional time. So actually the time it takes for each customer, rather than the decision's less important when it comes to measuring the resource. It's actually the outcome that's more important. So getting someone who's incredibly vulnerable into a situation where they're less so, can be quite costly, and I think councils have certainly found that as part of their experience, that the administrative funding that was provided has fallen some way short. I don't think there's a council in the country actually that thinks it's all right, we got enough money and we're delivering it quite happily. I think every council's faced pretty much the same issues.
Yeah. Leslie, is that the case? Yeah.
The funding for the admin doesn't even cover the software costs. But we welcome that's within the local authority. You touched on the community planning partnership. That's at the forefront of the delivery within Orkney. But being a small local authority as well, we were just similar to the others in that it seemed to sit well within the revenues and benefits. Not necessarily, I mean, already we've moved away from a specific member of the benefits team doing it, so it can't be done within within that team. Social services didn't seem to be too keen to take it on, and it seems to fit okay within that. It's a service we have no problems with at all. But the admin funding, I would suggest, is probably something like, I think 6,000 we get. We probably need around about 18, 4 times that, I would suspect.
Nicola, would that be the same for...
Yes, our funding covered 6 officers and a section leader. We've actually got myself working on it as one of the managers, and we have 4 staff taking calls. So yes, we are vastly underfunded as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I would just like to say we're in exactly the same position as Gary and Ian as regards the number of staff that we employ and the level of funding we received. And it's really only because it's still a house and benefits service there that we're able to move resources to provide the right level of service for the welfare fund. But it will be shown at the end of the year that it will be to the detriment of the house and benefits service.
Ross, we got admin costs of roughly 77,000. Our council has more than doubled that, but it's non-recurring funding going forward. So it's quite challenging.
That was the experience we got from the local authorities in dealing with the DHP. When these changes are having an impact beyond the actual individuals who are being affected by the benefits changes, but actually the administration and local authorities is having to be looked at again, and I'm not quite sure all of this has been taken into consideration. Kevin?
Convener, I think what would be interesting, and I don't know if any analysis has been done on this, is if that movement of staff is actually creating a saving in other services by actually dealing with the problem at its actual root. Because we all know if folk aren't helped at those initial stages, often other services end up having to deal with the crisis. Social work, education, housing, you name it, it can be affected. So I wonder if anybody yet, and I know it's early days, has started doing any analysis to see how much your staff are actually saving other services by dealing with us appropriately at the very beginning.
Steve?
You're right, it is too early. I think councils have been running at such a pace to deliver the service initially that beginning to look outwards to other services and say, can you provide us with some information about how our preventative work is assisting you in whatever area. There are some areas where we'd be keen to get information, Section 12, Section 22 payments within social work, you know, particularly issues of homelessness, things like that. We'd like to gather that information. But again, this goes back to some of the administrative funding. The staff are barely financed to deal with the situation at hand, and getting all of that other data collection to give you the kind of more full picture is really, really challenging at the moment, because all of these other departments are also in the midst of welfare reforms. You know, there's the under occupancy issue in terms of the housing sections, and there's real challenge there. So all departments of the council are currently working with very, very vulnerable groups. So actually trying to measure from a baseline of has it improved is very, very challenging, because everyone's affected slightly differently as benefits are changing.
Convener, I think it's also very important to find out if each of the local authorities have a welfare reform strategy or a poverty strategy which they're following, and if these things are analysed constantly. I know Stephen was talking about his own individual staff, but I see a corporate responsibility here for some of the analysis that we're talking about. And I'd be happy to hear any comments on that.
Well, come to Morag first. I don't know if you can add to that, but you were wanting to make a point.
It was probably, actually, I think Stephen just made the point at the end there, which is that what I think will be quite challenging is because we're in this changing landscape. We're not in steady state. You know, we've had the changes around the under-occupancy charge. We've had the council tax reduction scheme, we've had, you know, DHPs, and we're still seeing some of the changes coming through from welfare reform. So I think that just will make it quite difficult to actually measure whether you could classify what's happened with Scottish Welfare Fund as preventative spend and what the impact could potentially be. If I may just pick up on your next point with regard to a corporate approach, yes, I'm sure, you know, like all councils, Glasgow has a group of officers, both from within the council and out with the council, that meet regularly to look at what welfare reform changes holistically mean for Glasgow, both in terms of practically what that means in terms of the council having to deal with, you know, implement something like the Scottish Welfare Fund, and then wider, what are the implications for individuals. And so that's the approach that the council has taken. Glasgow City Council also has a poverty leadership panel that has set out some clear strategies of how we want to take that forward.
To answer Kevin's point, Ian?
Yeah, I think it's an important point to align the various corporate policies, and our welfare reform group and the strategy for that initially was focused on reacting and mitigation against any of the adverse impacts for individuals through the welfare reform changes. But very quickly that developed to look to the economic development strategy that the council had and to enhance employability. Basically to provide the levers for individuals to make choices and to move on from some of the circumstances that they find themselves in.
I don't see any other indications of comments. Is there any, just to wrap it up, is there anything that our witnesses would like to bring to the table that we haven't discussed yet? Was there something that you came along today that you wanted to get on the record? I'll give you an opportunity to do that. I'm not going to force you to speak if you don't want to, but if there's anything you think that we need to be aware of, anything that you think might be helpful, even if you go away after today and think, maybe I should have brought this to the attention of the committee, we're more than happy to receive written information from you, because we want to try and keep updated as best we can as we move forward. As things are changing with you, if you can keep us posted on just how these changes are happening, we'll benefit from that. Ken, you wanted to make a contribution?
First, apologies, I couldn't make it any earlier than 10:30. And just tell me if this has been covered before. I just wanted to ask specifically about authorities not giving cash awards to people, but using it was covered. Yeah, that's fine.
Just make sure it was done. Yeah, Ian.
Apologies, just to pick up on Mr McIntosh's point. Within Eastern Bartonshire, we don't provide cash for crisis grants. We use AllPay, which is one of the electronic means of passing on payment facilities. One of the advantages that we found with that, we haven't had any resistance or any adverse feedback from any of the claimants. One of the advantages that we found with that is we can focus in on specific commodities being allowed. For example, utilities and food clearly are commodities that can be allowed using that company's software, and there are other commodities that can be barred from it, you know, alcohol and certain other items as well. So we can exclude that because it's clearly out with the terms of the crisis intervention.
Have there been any independent assessments made independent from the local authority, that is, of how successful it is to use a system like that, or vouchers or goods as opposed to cash?
We haven't undertaken any independent assessments. What we do find is it gives us a clear audit trail of where the goods or the resources have been applied.
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, we did think that there was some teething problems. They were anecdotally we were being made aware, but obviously the work that you've been doing at a practical level and at the coal face, if you like, has filtered through, and some changes have been made as we move forward. And obviously, as we move towards the legislation, we'll continue to look at what guidance and direction is required to make sure that the maximum amount of people get the maximum amount of support. And I think that's what it's all about. So can I thank you all very much for coming along and informing us this morning. It's been very helpful from our point of view, and thanks very much for your input. Thank you. And I'll suspend the meeting for 10 minutes. move forward with this agenda item, and we come to our next panel of witnesses, which comprises the Minister and our officials. Minister, do you want to introduce your officials and make some opening comments, and then we'll get into a discussion on the points that you want to bring to our attention?
Okay, we've got Andrew Wogg from the Analytical Services, Anne McVie from the Welfare Team, and Jamie McDougall from the Housing Team, and obviously myself. And I would just say a few remarks at the start, if that's okay, Convener. Just that I welcome this opportunity to appear this morning and give evidence on the Scottish Welfare Fund and on discretionary housing payments. I think it's a timely discussion this morning as the statistics for DHPs were published this morning, and it shows that £21.9 million has already been expended to the 31st of December. And as you will be aware, we've asked the DWP to lift the cap in DHPs. We have written, the Deputy First Minister has written on the 31st of January to Lord Freud, and on the 10th of February to Ian Duncan-Smith, and again on the 26th of February to Ian Duncan-Smith, requesting an urgent phone call to discuss it, and we've had no response. The Finance Secretary, John Swinney, has also written on the 10th of March to George Osborne about this matter, because we believe very firmly that lifting the cap in DHPs would allow the Scottish Government to take the most effective action to help those affected by the bedroom tax. So we believe it very firmly, because it would cost the DWP nothing and the Westminster Government nothing. They would make the savings that they intend to make through the bedroom tax, but it would also allow the Scottish Government to take the actions that the Scottish Parliament passed by agreeing that lifting the cap in DHPs is the most effective way forward. Lifting the cap doesn't make up for the cost to the other parts of the Scottish Government's pressured budget. Lifting the cap would not be a solution to the bedroom tax. I think we're all agreed that only the abolition will solve that, but the DHPs are the best way to mitigate the effects. The governments have a view it's shocking that in order to protect our citizens and to protect our own devolved housing policy, that the Scottish Governments had to divert funds from other devolved responsibilities to mitigate the damage being done by the Westminster Government. And we continue to pursue that. We think that's wrong, because we can't mitigate all the impacts of welfare reform. I'll just say a bit now about the Scottish Welfare Fund. It did have a slow start, and I think that's been agreed, and I listened to the panel discussion before now, but I think it's now clear that the spending in the fund is increasing and it's becoming close to its projected levels, and informal monitoring of the fund is showing that, and I think that was why we reacted to what we heard from practitioners and local authorities, and we widened the guidance to make the access to the fund easier. We also coordinated a significant marketing effort to publicise the fund through various media channels and through third sector contacts, because we recognised it wasn't always going to be individuals themselves that approached a local authority to make an application. Very often it was a third party or third sector organisation working with vulnerable groups, so they had to be well aware of the fund, and we believe those actions are working. And we have our latest leaflet here, which we'll leave some with the clerk. So we think now that the fund is on track. What we have in place is a scheme that does benefit from local delivery, and I think that was clear from the previous panel, offering potential to address underlying needs of applicants by providing access to a broader range of services. I am pleased that the part all of us have played in establishing the fund and the hard work done by the local authorities, because we recognise it's been a challenge, it was something new, but we can see just how it is helping vulnerable people in communities throughout Scotland. We're not complacent about it. We know we can do more, and we continue to work with our local authority partners to ensure that the fund gets out to everyone that we think requires assistance from it. I'm happy now to take questions.
Thanks very much, Minister. And I concur with a lot of what you've said about where the problems lie and just how difficult it's going to be to mitigate the impact of these changes. Just to I'm glad you've got some statisticians with you, because I think we've been getting into some of these figures, and it's helpful to sort of clarify just exactly how we're moving forward, whether the demands are being met. When the Deputy First Minister announced the creation of the Scottish Welfare Fund, she said that it would help 100,000 extra people. Now, we needed some clarification around that, and we've been trying to get exactly what type of figures we are talking about. And I think we've had, as we've moved forward, some clarity that it wasn't 100,000 extra people. It would have been possibly 100,000 claimants, and then, since people can make multiple claims, the actual figures might not be around 100,000. So I think as an indicative figure, it needed a bit of clarification. But with the figures that we've had so far up till September, around 39 or 40,000 applicants had been made until applications had been made until September, with about 25,000 awards. Are we getting near the figures that the Deputy First Minister set out when she announced the fund, or how far short are we going to be?
I think when the fund was announced, it was the awards it wasn't individuals or numbers of people that would be assisted. It was about the number of awards compared to the awards that had been made under the previous social fund awards. And perhaps, Andrew, if you've got the exact figures there, you might.
What I can say, in the 6 months up to September at the end of September 2013, there was, in terms of the actual awards, so that the stats work on a number of different levels. You can look at the households that received awards, how many awards those households got. So if I just talk about, there was about 36,000 sort of unique households that received funds from the Scottish Welfare Fund. And those 36,000 households, of those there was 33,000 crisis grant awards paid out, and also about 12,000 community care grants that were paid out. So we're talking about, in the first 6 months, that about 36,000 unique households received funds from the Scottish Welfare Fund.
I was just going to start by talking about global figures and early reported performance from local authority areas. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the extreme differences that there are in the figures up to the 30th of September, because we've already discussed with the representatives of different local authorities what the problems were. But is the Minister now in a position to say that there is a greater understanding of why there was substantial differences in early performance, and how we're going to avoid that wide variation in future?
In terms of the variation, in terms of the number of awards per local authority area, are you referring to?
Yes, simply the old problem with trying to get the money into the hands of the recipients. We have a graph in front of us that shows that best performance the 30th of September was above 95% of projection, and poorest performance was only 25% of projection. Are we confident, or is the Minister confident, that she understands why that variation happened and how we're going to avoid that wide variation in future?
Yeah, I think we're confident that now there is a better understanding and consistency within local authorities. I think we heard earlier from some of the people speaking about the challenges if it went straight to revenue and benefits section, who worked in very strict legal framework before, and having to apply discretion. I think extending the guidance has also helped, and I also think one of the reasons was that many local authorities decided at the outset, because they anticipated a huge demand for the service, they then only awarded to highest priority, and they now recognise that they can step down to middle or lower priority. So I think local authorities are now well on top of the scheme in their area, how it works in their area, what changes they have to make, and we'll continue to work with them to ensure that we get the funding is kept up at the level now that it's reaching, when we're hearing from all local authorities that they are almost coming to their anticipated spend, and I would hope that will continue, and we'll work with them to ensure that does happen.
So can we assume then that the government's guidelines for the administration of the scheme will from now on have the effect of ensuring greater consistency, or will it be necessary to give additional guidance to local authorities to ensure that we do have more consistency in future?
I think the scheme is designed very clearly to have that local flexibility, and I think that's what makes the scheme in some ways very successful, and we wouldn't want to take away the local flexibility, but the guidance and how the scheme can be accessed and those eligible for it is just guidance, but we have regular meetings with practitioners meetings to ensure that, and practitioners from all over Scotland come and talk to each other about how they make the awards, how to get that kind of consistency, what's right. So I'm quite confident that local authorities are working towards that. I think the will is there clearly, that everybody wants to ensure that the money gets out to those that need it most. And I'm quite confident that local authorities are working towards that, and I'm sure that consistency will be there.
One of the surprising things in the graphic information we've been given is that local authorities, in some cases neighbouring local authorities with very similar needs or demands, find themselves in very different positions in that first 6 months. Are we confident that that kind of wide variation within quite specific local areas sometimes will not be repeated in future?
We would hope not to see such a wide variation in neighbouring areas, but we still, I would still maintain there has to be that local flexibility, but we wouldn't anticipate to see wide variations, and we would anticipate that the spend is as projected as we move into the new financial year.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, in our last session, I certainly got a sense, I think we all got a sense that there's been good cooperation between local government and the Scottish Government in finessing the scheme, and if a need has been identified, as there has been, to alter the guidance, that's happened through dialogue. And I'm just wondering, going forward, how you and the Scottish Government will draw upon that expertise and that experience that's been built up in local government to help inform the legislation that will be taken forward to put the Scottish Welfare Fund on a statutory footing?
Well, we'll certainly be using that. We'll be using the information we get, the feedback we get from Heriot-Watt University, because we'll be conducting a review. We also, want to make sure that the partnerships continue to work together, not just with local authorities, but with the third sector, to continue the dialogue, because there has been very good dialogue regarding the Scottish Welfare Fund, both in putting together the scheme we're currently operating, and will continue to do that before we finalise the Welfare Funds Scotland bill. So all of that, what we've learned so far, we'll continue with. I think that's important. I think it's worked well, and there's lots of goodwill out there to make sure that this does work correctly.
We had the folk from Heriot-Watt here, and they were very helpful for our deliberations too. Can I turn to the issue you raised about the discretionary housing payments and the various correspondence that's been sent to the UK Government? Can I just clarify one area of that? You've referred to a number of letters that have gone out, but there was one that went from the Deputy First Minister, I think you said, to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which called for an urgent phone call. When was that sent?
That one was, I think, 26th of February. 26th of February, that was.
And we're now at what? We're now at the 18th of March, so that's a fairly lax interpretation of urgent, I would think, from the UK Government. I wonder if
I think it's extremely disappointing that we haven't had a response at this stage, particularly when we've made it very clear that we would like this by the 1st of April, so that we can, from the 1st of April, we absolutely know the way forward for discretionary housing payments and the bedroom tax. So it is disappointing, and hopefully the letter that Mr Swinney has written to George Osborne now might speed things along, but we certainly would like to have that by the 1st of April.
We're in touch with the UK Government as well. I wonder if we might want to reflect on that.
We'll be looking at a letter to Mr Smith later. Kevin?
Thank you, Convener. All of these letters back and forward, and always pretty negative responses. One day they might actually appear in front of this committee, and then again pigs might fly. Convener, I think there is pretty varying results here from some of the local authorities. And I'm all for flexibility and autonomy when it comes to local government, but a huge difference between the proportion of CCG applications awarded with Aberdeen City way down there, unfortunately, and Orkney, where almost 100%, according to the chart, who have applied have received an award. We heard earlier from Perth and Kinross in particular, who were talking about using CCG payments as preventative spend. And I think that's what we would all like to see. How do we actually encourage the local authorities that are doing less well? How are we going to benchmark each of the local authorities to see what good practice is going on and where there is room for improvement? Have the Heriot Watt people got a remit to do that, or are your own statisticians going to look at benchmarking?
Would certainly be, I mean, I'll maybe let Anne or Andrew comment on this as well, but certainly once we get a full year's stats, we'll have a much clearer picture of, because we know the first 6 months are not, were a slow start and what was not what we anticipated how the fund would go. We do know that informal monitoring is showing that that is changing and improving, but I think we need to wait till we see the next 6 months stats to look at how we can benchmark and share good practice. But good practice is currently being shared out there. We also fund a COSLA officer to deal with the Scottish Welfare Fund, to go around local authorities as well, to talk to them. I'm also visiting local authorities. I visited Aberdeenshire on Friday, which was very useful to talk to those operating the fund, to see the challenges that they faced and how they want to take it forward. And we'd certainly want to look at that across Scotland, because I think you're absolutely right that the preventative aspect of it is quite high in the agenda, particularly with the community care grants. It is a bit preventative, and there should be that sort of holistic service provided to individuals. I don't know if you want to comment any more on that, Anne?
Just to add to what the Minister said, I think we've referred previously in this committee to the workshops that we've had with local authority practitioners. We've had 2 rounds of workshops already with decision makers based around the 4 DWP districts in Scotland, so that there is an opportunity for the partnership managers from DWP to take part in some of those discussions, so that we can share practice. And we are in the process with our development officer at COSLA. We're in the process of organising a 3rd round of workshops to take place towards the beginning of May, so we can reflect on the experience of the first full year's running of the operation of the Welfare Fund, informed by the publication of the stats. And the fact that the stats are going to be published every quarter gives local authorities an opportunity to reflect on their own performance and see where they are in the kind of, in the charts, and think what they might want to do at a local level to help reduce that variation in practice across, or in spend across local authorities.
I think in terms of the variation, I think one of the interesting questions might be about those graphs on chart 12 and chart 13 in the first 6 months of the Scottish Welfare Fund statistics. I think that they've been done on the average award. So that's just looking at going back to these different levels, whether it's a household can have multiple awards. It might be that some local authorities are giving multiple awards of, say, I don't know, a small amount, whereas another local authority might just be wrapping that up in one award. So there could be a sort of a multiple awards effect for each household that's going on there. So we'll certainly do more work looking at that, and I think and we'll be doing a lot more work. It was the first 6 months of the data. There were issues certainly for a couple of local authorities that had sort of incomplete data, or perhaps hadn't submitted all their data by the time of publication. But these are issues that we're taking forward and working to resolve with the local authorities.
For the first year, do you think we'll get that type of breakdown? Because again, going back to this figure of the 100,000 beneficiaries, if you like, I mean, if we're having a situation where some local authorities are identifying each individual payout, whereas others are looking at one claimant, and whether it's multiple claims allocating them to one beneficiary. Will we get statistics on that, and will we be able to break that down to test whether the amount of people who received or the amount of claims that were given were anywhere near where the predictions were set out?
The statistics for the full financial year are scheduled for release in July 2014. The date's been set on and it's on the Scottish Government website. Obviously, I can't comment on what the data will say because we don't have we haven't published yet and we haven't received that data. But the date for publication for the annual stats it's in July 2014.
Follow on the benchmarking line, because obviously it seems that most councils have slotted this work into their revenues and benefits services. And we've heard that today that obviously there are pressures in other parts of the business that they previously are still undertaking in terms of housing benefit and the rest. In terms of the benchmarking that is done, are we actually going to look at the impacts on not only these particular areas but also on housing benefit payout, other benefit payments, including council tax reduction, where performance in Scottish councils has been particularly high. And if we're going to do that, are we also going to ensure that the DWP are aware of the impacts of the decisions that they have taken on these folks in revenue and benefits services in the country, and beyond that, the obvious impact that there is in the people of Scotland with these changes?
In terms of the benchmarking in terms of housing benefit, that's obviously reserved, and we can only keep statistics on discretionary housing payments. But housing benefits reserved, and it would be that information I think comes from the UK. Am I correct in saying that? In terms of council tax reduction, yes, that's our own scheme, and we can look at how councils perform in that, but I think they perform very highly in that. Regards the Scottish Welfare Fund, yes, for me, the key priority is ensuring that the money that we've set aside to assist vulnerable people in emergency situations or in situations when there's no money, or when they're getting a new home and they've nothing to put in it, or they're someone staying in the community, coming out of prison, coming out of care, that we have a quick and responsive service to them, and that money gets out there to them. And that's the priority. If at the end of the year we're finding that in some areas that's not happening, then we need to talk to these areas. We need to look at where it's happening well, where it's going well, and we need to talk to the areas where it's not going as well. And I think we will continue to do that. In terms of the benchmarking with council tax reduction, that doesn't fall certainly within us, but perhaps, Andrew, you might know.
Convener, about my point of benchmarking in terms of housing benefit, and I'm well aware that most of the benchmarking is dealt with by UK, but in terms of processing times, which was a key indicator, housing benefit processing times, which was a key indicator for local government in terms of the benchmarking suite.
Because it's a reserve matter and I'm not responsible for the housing benefit statistics, I'm not quite sure what information the DWP collect on that.
Convener, I may be confusing things, because there is a benchmarking statistic which is used in terms of processing times, as in what the councils do to help with the benefits process. Obviously, I was trying to gather whether there is an effect on these kinds of everyday work that local authorities were doing previously, normally by revenue and benefits teams, who have had this added work in terms of CCG and crisis grants. So that's where I was trying to get to, but maybe you don't have that information.
I'm not sure what information that the DWP collect on housing benefits. If there is that information that could be cross-tabbed with processing times for the Scottish Welfare Fund, we could have a look at the different data sets. But I think any information that the DWP might collect, it might just be presented at an aggregate level by local authority.
Still not making myself really clear, I don't think, here. And maybe I should have one last bang. I realise that the DWP do most of the stats in terms of housing benefit. But one of the key indicators which there has always been in local government is the processing time for housing benefit claims which are carried out by local authorities. They have been carried out in the main by revenues and benefit services, and obviously they've got this additional work. I wonder if it is taking local authorities longer to process housing benefit claims, which would then go to the DWP. And it will be interesting to see if you would compare previous stats, previous figures that local authorities have achieved in terms of that, and what they're managing to do now with this additional work that has been put upon them because of the DWP's changes. Is that clearer?
Yeah, I understand. I think it might be, if it's possible to compare the two figures, the conclusion that's drawn, though, if you did compare them, how would you know that it was, you know, that the welfare, if there was a difference, that it was the welfare fund that had caused any change in performance vis-a-vis other welfare reform changes that were in?
I understand that, but I mean, we've heard today in evidence from folk that, yeah, they're managing to deal with the Scottish Welfare Fund now, after a slow start, but they indicated that they were maybe not doing as well in terms of their other areas of business that they used to carry out on a day-to-day basis. And I think, you know, one of the things which we need to do is to look at all of the impacts on the folks in benefits and revenue services across the country, not only with the additional Scottish welfare work that they have to do, but also all of the other burdens that the DWP has thrust upon them, and how that is affecting folk. Because at the end of the day, if it's taking folk in revenues and benefit offices longer to process the likes of housing benefit claims, that could end up getting folk into even more crisis if they're not actually going to get the required housing benefit over that period. So, you know, I think it's grand for us to concentrate on the Scottish Welfare Fund here, but obviously there are obvious other impacts that are going to be had in revenue and benefits offices with this additional work, plus the additional burdens that have been put on upon them by the DWP. And I think it's important that we don't do all of this in isolation. Convener, is my point.
I'm certainly happy to look at what's raised there, but you know, in some local authorities, it's not revenue and benefits that are administering the social fund; it's the social work department. So we need to look at the amount of work that's involved. We believe that the funding that local authorities were given to administer the Scottish Welfare Fund was a fair amount of money. It's around 15% of the total cost of the fund, but certainly we'll look at the point you raise. I think it is right to raise that, and local authorities in COSLA have raised it in the past about the costs to administer it, but it's not just in revenue and benefits section in terms of processing their housing benefits. We would have to look then at the impacts for local authorities who use social work staff to do it, and I don't know how much of that we can gather, but we can certainly look at that and come back to the committee if we can get any information on that.
Because, Convener, I'll just finish on this point, because obviously, whether it be revenue and benefit staff or social work staff or whoever it may be, you know, the level of business that these folk are undertaking now is obviously increased. So that means, you know, that some other things that were done previously are probably not being done. And I think that we need to highlight all of these things to the DWP in terms of these changes, which were supposed to save lots of money, but in reality are probably creating lots and lots of crisis for folk right across the board, which is actually costing the state much more money and having to deal with crisis at the end of the day.
I think those figures are out there, Minister, because some of the witnesses that we had earlier were able to tell us how many staff they'd had to increase their teams by in order to administer the Scottish Welfare Fund, and some were able to put specific financial figures on the increased cost. So it may be that we could collate that information and just see what the direct impact has been.
I'm not saying we wouldn't do that. What I'm saying is that the Scottish Government has given through the settlement funding for local authorities to administer the Scottish Welfare Fund. And we certainly can't take money from the fund to give to local authorities for further administration of it. That means less people getting affected by the fund. I have no disagreement in giving the full figure to the DWP, but clearly we haven't had a great deal of success with them so far, but willing to highlight those issues that, you know, the cost, they are making the savings. I think the point that Mr Stewart's making is that, yes, the UK government are making the savings, but the cost is not going to be in them. It's going to be in the Scottish government and in the people living here. And I think that's the difference. They're happy, they've made their savings, but the cost is not to them.
I think there is agreement around the table that that's the fact, but we also heard that the money that had been allocated in terms of administration has been short of what's actually been required in order to do the administration, and we can't ignore that fact. If you're saying that you think a fair figure was given to the local authorities to administer it, then the evidence that we took this morning was it was falling short, and we can't ignore that point either. But Linda?
Yeah, it's in the same theme, and Andrew, you'll probably find my attempt to talk about these statistics even more confusing than Kevin's.
Maybe not.
But I totally buy into what Kevin Stewart is saying about having to look at all this holistically across authorities. And that was actually a word that was used quite extensively this morning by the officers that came to give us evidence and a recognition that it is a holistic approach. Having said that, I also totally understand the pressure that ministers and departments are under to come up with all these statistics to show all the different aspects of it. And I know that we're only 6 months in when we come to this. But what I would like to see, as well as a sort of expansion into what Kevin Stewart was saying about the holistic approach to the preventative spend, is some more meaningful statistics in relation to that, even with just this one part. And I think what I'm trying to get at is I would like it to be qualitative rather than quantitative, and I think governments often fall into the trap of producing all these graphs, which actually just costs local authorities and others quite a lot in resources to try and come up with all these figures. And I just use as example, and tell me, Andrew, if I'm reading this completely wrong, if we look at charts 12 and 13, you know, they both have the caveat to say there's no evidence to suggest any relationship between the two variables. As a layperson, my first question then is, well, why are they both in the same chart? What's that about? Right? And the other way I look at it is, we're hearing this morning that there is a great support out there for the fact that we're having local administration of this fund, as opposed to the Welsh Fund, for example. People are really pleased that there's a local flexibility on this. So then when I look at, if we look at the community care grant application part, and you've got Aberdeen City way down below 40%, you've got Orkney up at nearly 100%, and in first glance that looks like there's absolutely no uniformity at all across the country. But then you think, well, there might be loads of other reasons for that. You know, maybe some local authorities run it in such a way that that people don't actually have to apply because they've found another solution for them. And I think there's just so much that is not said in these statistics that we have to question whether the statistics are in fact worthwhile as we move on. Right, Andrew.
Good question. What I'd first like to say is, so we've done looked at the proportion of applications awarded versus average spend. So if that graph hadn't been in there, one of the questions that people might have levelled at us would be that are those local authorities that are giving the biggest awards, are they sort of being more so if the award is biggest in those authorities, are they being tighter? Are they only sort of not awarding as many people the awards? And so that's what the point of saying that there's no evidence there is that there's no evidence to suggest that the more generous local authorities are giving smaller awards and vice versa. So I think I'm very pleased that the stats are getting so much coverage and debate, so I think that shows that there is some value to them there. I recognise that the stats can't answer all the questions, but I think they are very important sort of can openers, and the fact that we spent sort of 10 minutes at the start of the session looking at just those two charts would suggest that those charts might be particularly helpful to the committee. In terms of burden for local authorities, the way that the whole data monitoring system has been set up here is that we get a dump directly from local authority systems. So where their systems are working well, and that's the case certainly in about 30 out of 32 of the local authorities, it takes the local authority less than a minute to transfer the data from their system to ours. So the information that's being collected is the day-to-day information that the local authority would be gathering in any case as part of administration of the fund. So in terms of the extra burden on them, it's probably taking them about a minute to transfer the data over to us. So I'd say that we're getting a lot of very high-quality, useful information. The information that we've got here is just a subset of what's available that will inform us as we move forward through the Welfare Fund.
All I can say to that is,
Ken might have more to say. Ken.
Can I just recap just for a second, Minister? Just tell me, do you think that the DHP funds will be fully allocated by the end of the financial year?
We think the problem with some of the DHP funds is, again, it's on the DWP allocation, and the DWP allocation doesn't necessarily meet the need. So in areas where the greatest need for DHPs is, I think the funds will be fully allocated. Areas where the DWP allocation was too generous, then they may not be used up. But what I would say is that I'm very clear in this, the Scottish Government is very clear in this, that there should be no local authority at the end of the financial year having people with arrears of the bedroom tax and still have unallocated DHP funding. That shouldn't happen.
If they do have arrears, will they be able to carry that? Will they be able to carry it over and claim it in the subsequent financial year?
We are certainly looking at that just now. We have to wait till we get to the end of the year to see what arrears are there, what arrears are there solely because of the bedroom tax. Now, how local authorities deal with that is one thing, but in terms of the Scottish Government's made it clear that there will be full mitigation for the next financial year, and part of that, if the cap is not lifted, if the cap's lifted, it resolves part of the problem, because DHPs can be backdated. They can be made as a one-off payment for arrears if they're sitting in the end of the year, and we haven't ruled out that arrears from this current year will not be met by any funding from the Scottish Government.
Just one other question in that area. Without if you take the bedroom tax out of it, DHPs would still be used in some cases to help some families, would they not?
DHPs have always have been in the go for a long time, and DHPs were not used very frequently by local authorities. They can be used, and were generally used in the private sector. They were used for one-off people in financial difficulties to meet their housing needs. So they generally were used for short periods, 3 months or a month or whatever. With the top-up funding that the Scottish Government has provided, then local authorities will be able to make the award for a longer period.
Are you able to make any kind of assessment? I'm just slightly concerned that the folks in the bedroom tax will have displaced any support that would have been given for example, private sector tenants.
Ensure that should happen. DHPs are topped up to the maximum.
No, but what I mean is, have you made any assessment of that?
Well, no, because it's local authorities who determine. I mean, local authorities should not be at the expense of other people, other families who would be eligible for a DHP. A DHP is there to be paid for people in struggle to meet their housing needs. So whether that's struggling because of the bedroom tax or struggling because they have a top-up to pay in the private sector or for whatever reason, then local authorities, as long as they're consistent in making their decision-making, should make those payments.
Can I just ask about the process times? I noticed that you're saying in the statistics you've given us today, 82% of crisis grant applications were processed within the 2-day working limit. Do you know how that compares to how crisis grants, the speed in which crisis grants were awarded?
Crisis loans?
Crisis loans, sorry, yes, the social fund. Was that
comparison? We don't have that.
Is it
We'll try and get that.
It's just, I mean, one of the concerns that has been raised by the voluntary sector has been that there have been delays. And I'm not sure whether there's any statistics to back that up or not, or how it compares. Clearly, it's a different system, and people will be confused, and there'll be different processes and so on, but it's just to find out whether there's help. Can I ask, do you think it's right that people applying to the welfare fund are referred to food banks?
I think, and I've said this several times, I don't think anybody who is eligible for a payment from the Scottish Welfare Fund, if they're eligible for a payment and have been assessed as eligible for a payment for food support, should be sent to a food bank. That goes with, well, I've said that several times, but I do think there will be people who make an application to the Scottish Welfare Fund who, for whatever, are not eligible for a payment from the Scottish Welfare Fund, and they may then be referred to a food bank. I was also given an example when I was talking to a Scottish welfare team where they were processing the application. It was at a weekend. They couldn't get the payment out because it's PayPoint. It's not cash money. The claimant collects it, the person collects it at a cash point, and they'd come out of prison, and the Scottish Welfare Fund was a great success story for that person, but they couldn't get the actual cash to him in time. So what they said is, until Monday, if you want, you can get food at the food bank to see through till Monday. In Monday, you'll be able to get access to cash point to get help with your food, help your, all the other things that were put in place. And so that's another example of when maybe somebody in an emergency situation, when the cash can't be got to them immediately, and that needs there immediately, then a food bank may be one way of doing it, other than, say, come back on Monday. It's the choice, it's about the need, and that's part of the discretion that the officers are making when they're arriving at their decision, but absolutely not, as a first instance, somebody who should get a payment from the Scottish Welfare Fund, that's where they should get the payment.
I agree. I mean, there have been food banks for a long time. It's perhaps the huge increase in the reliance on food banks that's the more worrying trend. Do you think that when the Scottish Welfare Fund is more established, do you think that will that will help lead to a reduction? Would you want to see it lead to a reduction in the reliance on food banks?
I think everybody in this room would want to see a reduction in the reliance on food banks. I think we're all ashamed that in a country as prosperous as Scotland, so many people are having to rely on food banks. I think that goes without saying. But we don't know, there's other changes will come in from Westminster. We've seen the very strict sanctions regime coming in. And the Scottish Welfare Fund will not be able to support every single person in a sanction for the length of time they're in a sanction. I think that's because people can be sanctioned for 3 years. People are getting sanctioned for weeks and months. So, to say yes, if things were as they're at, and if the Scottish Welfare Fund, once it's used to full, the mitigation comes in for the bedroom tax, all the other measures the Scottish Government have put in place to help families with increase their income and best use of their income. I think when all of that's in place, you could say, yes, there should be less reliance on food banks. But most of the reason why people are going to food banks is not anything that's been created by the Scottish Government, it's been created by the Westminster Government. And we can't control what they're going to do next.
It's not, certainly not implying that it is. It's more, perhaps I would put it another way, is it a specific policy objective of the Scottish Welfare Fund to reduce people's reliance on food banks?
When the Scottish Welfare Fund was set up, the food bank sort of escalation in food banks wasn't an issue. This committee was very much involved in the setting up of the Scottish Welfare Fund, and in the guidance and in the criteria that should be set, and in preparing the guidance, as was the third sector. So all of that was done, and the food bank, Rest Reliance in food banks wasn't part of that. What we're seeing is we have the Scottish Welfare Fund. We're actually seeing that from the Scottish Welfare Fund, it's now, the spend is as projected, but there are still people relying on food banks for other reasons that are being created out with anything that the Scottish Government can do.
But if the Scottish Welfare Fund is the last resort for most people, it's the last way, the ultimate safety net for people, do you not think it should be a policy objective of the Welfare Fund to try and reduce reliance on food banks?
I've always said from the start that the food banks should not be part of the welfare system, either in an independent Scotland or in the current system we're in. Food banks should not be part of the system and shouldn't be replacing any part of a welfare system. So they're not, it's my view that the Scottish Welfare Fund is there to help people in an emergency, but what we are aware of that many people who are using food banks, some people are using them for just a one-off situation, but where more and more people are turning up at food banks because of problems. All the evidence is suggesting that because of problems with the welfare, the UK welfare system. So yes, we would hope to see less reliance on food banks. Yes, nobody who's entitled to a payment out of the Scottish Welfare Fund should be referred to a food bank in the first instance. And yes, I would sincerely hope we'll see less food banks in Scotland. But I can't say that other measures taken by Westminster is going to put further pressure on the Scottish Welfare Fund, further pressure on Scottish local authorities, and further pressure on food banks.
Finally, just one question about these statistics are very useful to give us a picture of what's happening. Are you making any kind of qualitative assessment of the impact of the Scottish Welfare Fund and possibly even of discretionary housing payment? In other words, whether they are working, how they are helping people, what people's reaction to them is, how it's affecting their welfare, both their mental and their physical welfare. Are you making any kind of assessment in that sense?
Yeah. I mean, for the first 6 months, as I say, it was slow. We are looking very much at that, and I think that can be done. We're getting case studies and information from local authorities over Scotland about the impact and how not just the payment from the Scottish Welfare Fund, but how it integrates with other services and the impact that that is making in people's lives and the positive impact it can make in their lives. And we'd hope to continue with that. And I don't know if we want to say further on that and how we're...
Just to refer to the evaluation work that Heriot Watt is undertaking for us at the moment, and it's looking very much at the effect of the scheme from the user's perspective, and we hope to publish that in the next couple of months.
So the Heriot Watt study is the main study that's going to give us a feel for...
It's the most systematic way of looking at the effect of the scheme, or how well the scheme is operating at the moment.
Will the Heriot Watt scheme cover whether or not people are falling between? I mean, it's very complicated at the moment with the changes, with some responsibilities being devolved to the Scottish Parliament, with the growth of food banks and so on. Will it look at whether or not people are actually finding their way between the different systems and the bureaucracy of the two systems?
There are a lot of questions about how easy it is to access the welfare fund, so I would hope that we would get some information out of that as to whether people are being signposted to the most appropriate source of help.
Just for the record, Heriot Watt will be coming in front of the committee again to talk about that report. Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Yeah, I mean, just picking up on the immediately preceding conversation, I mean, obviously, you know, as we've heard in our discussion the other week with food bank providers, an awful lot of this is happening directly as a result of Westminster policies, which many of us don't support. We certainly don't have any control over. So I would argue that the way to solve the problem is to take control over those policy areas. It seems quite straightforward to me. But going back to the Scottish Welfare Fund, we had an interesting discussion earlier on with our local authority partners about the best delivery method, because I had raised the question, did they feel that local authority was the best delivery method, or did they feel, for example, that the Welsh Government had got it right by using a private sector outfit? And I just wonder if you would confirm that the Government's intention here, is it very much to stick with the local authority delivery model when we get to the stage of looking at the legislation to come?
That is very much the intention of the Scottish Government, and I think clearly I was quite heartened by what I heard of the discussion this morning, just how the scheme can be flexible, how it can be preventative, how it can meet the needs for individuals in different areas of Scotland, and how much the local authorities have bought into that and worked to get this scheme up and running. So it's very much our intention. We continue to work with local authorities, and the Scottish Welfare Scotland fund scheme will be very much on that basis and administered through local authorities, taking view, allowing that flexibility in local need.
Okay, well that's heartening to hear, Minister. And in terms of the discussion that we've had in this session and the previous session about flexibility and discretion, we also had a discussion in the earlier session this morning about the different local authorities' approaches to cash payments versus vouchers versus provision of goods and so on. And there were very good reasons why each local authority that discussed the matter came to the view that they did in terms of how they have decided to proceed, taking into account local circumstances. And I just wonder, going forward, is that the intention to have that general approach decided at the level of the local authority once we get to look at the legislation to come?
I think we'll look at different methods of providing it, but certainly have discretion in local authority areas, whether it be cash, whether it be PayPoint, whether it be goods, new goods. And clearly what's come out of this is that local authorities can get a lot more for their money by procuring goods for individuals. They can get so that the money is going further doing that. And I think local authorities would want to have that flexibility in any future scheme. I think the evidence is showing that community care grants are generally paid for or generally supplied by goods, and crisis grants as an immediate crisis is cash, whether it be cash at the pay point or cash into an account or whatever. And I think we would want that to continue.
Yeah, I mean, I was very interested. I think it was the representative from Glasgow City Council who was talking about the use of blindcraft and recycled goods, and how actually that was a lot cheaper for the budget for the local authority concerned. And also, of course, there were many other social goods involved in that approach. And it was very pleasing to see this broader approach looking at the issue in terms of taking many different kinds of boxes and not just a straightforward budgetary consideration. And my last question, Convener, if I may, in terms of we've all looked at the very detailed statistics, and it is good to have that. But in terms of just a kind of easily understood, statement as to where we are, as far as the Scottish Welfare Fund is concerned, where we have through the Scottish Government has topped up the basic provision coming from the DWP to the tune of some £9 million. But in terms of even taking that away and looking at the DWP allocated spend, where are we at the moment in Scotland in terms of the percentage of even just the DWP allocated spend? Because that might be easier to understand than many of these charts, as well produced as they are.
I don't know if Andrew wants to say something, but in terms of the informal monitoring that we have, I think it's very clear that by the end of this financial year, had we not topped it up, the fund would be exhausted. I think that's what the informal monitoring is showing. I don't know. Obviously, you might not want to talk about informal monitoring.
I've only got the stats up to the end of September to talk about, and I've not looked at how much, just what the DWP component of the funding was. So I'm afraid I can't give you any more detail.
Or perhaps it's something in due course we could get from.
We can
that would be great.
Confirm that
I think we had it to September, and we were certainly higher.
It's always
than
helpful for the committee
absolutely.
to
We can get that
understand.
to you.
We're fully.
Lovely, thank you.
Some we've got with us today, but we can.
Great, thank you very much.
If you could do that, and I think that would be useful.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Just one question, Minister, just for clarification. You mentioned at the outset you're waiting on the phone call back from Ian Duncan-Smith, and I hope you're not holding your breath. But in the meantime, we are aware that Audit Scotland approved 2 alternative methods for hardship support to social housing tenants. In conversations I've had with other local authorities, they have looked at other mechanisms by which they're not the same as Renfrewshire Councils or the East Lothian programme. But in the small print of Audit Scotland's report, it said that if a local authority was currently operating a similar method or a method which was supporting hardship funds, it only required the authorisation of Scottish ministers to allow them to continue to do that. So are you involved in discussions with local authorities about other ways of delivering support to people affected by the bedroom tax other than DHP?
Well, what we're currently doing as officials will certainly be meeting with Audit Scotland as well, and Jamie might want to add a bit about that. We are aware that there's other schemes out there. What we're very clear about is that we believe that DHPs is the best way forward. It entitles people to the money at the start. It goes immediately to their rent account. It's legal. They don't build up any debts with it. And that, to me, is a far preferable to people building up debts with the potential of getting it written off. There are problems with some of the other schemes in terms of regular payments going into someone's rent account. Not just in terms of the scheme, but in terms of somebody's in a means-tested benefit and they get a regular payment every week, that can impact as income. So there's a whole range of unintended consequences that could happen. So what we are clear is that from the 1st of April, there will be, and maybe Jamie will correct the figure here, but there will be over £30 million available from the 1st of April for local authorities for discretionary housing payments. And the Scottish Government has committed that we will ensure that there will be full mitigation and looking at a scheme, and that scheme may include debt write-off, but we have to bear in mind it's not just local authorities. 46% of tenants affected are in housing associations, so we need to make sure that whatever scheme is can be accessed, but it will be based on need, where that there is the need. It won't be based, it will just not be a straightforward allocation. I think that's what we're looking at is suggesting. Jamie, do you want to say something about it?
Just taking the DHP scheme, there's going to be £35 million available from the 1st of April through that fund. That includes £20 million that the Scottish Government has confirmed will be added from the 1st of April. In terms of other schemes, we've been in regular contact with COSLA, with councils about other schemes. What we're unfortunately working within is very tightly constrained boundaries in terms of the reservations set out in the Scotland Act. Similarly, local authorities are bound by other legislation. We're actually speaking to North Lanarkshire Council on Thursday to talk through their scheme. We're talking to Audit Scotland tomorrow to talk through about their technical bulletin they sent out to councils to discuss it. One point I would raise to the committee's attention is that when Audit Scotland looked at the Renfrewshire scheme, which I believe it then based this letter and sent it around all councils, it states in it, we recommend that this type of mitigation is clearly described as a debt write-off policy and procedural documents and communications to tenants and reported as debt write-off in the financial statements and any other financial reports. I think what we're seeing is there's two options available. One is through discretionary housing payments, and I think the Minister's clearly set out why that's the preferred route, and I believe that was discussed and agreed in the Parliament during the budget debate. However, there is an alternative route which we're looking at in the event that we do not get the cap on DHPs lifted. But as far as we are aware, and like I say, we'll be discussing this with Audit Scotland this week and other councils this week, from our point of view, it boils down to there would be debt write-off schemes.
North Lanarkshire was one of the examples I was thinking of because I did have a conversation with them. And although they have been using DHP and had actually maximised the amount that was available before the Scottish Government made the money available, they actually prefer the system that they're operating to DHP, and were looking to get the approval of the minister for using their scheme, which apparently is also used by individual local authorities in England. So I'll let you get on with the discussions, but it's just to make clear that there are alternatives, and some local authorities prefer their alternatives to DHP.
We'll be discussing this with the council on Thursday. We understand that some councils would prefer this method due to the lesser administrative burden that's on it, and also due to the fact that under DHP rules an application must be made, whereas the council can choose just to to write off debts that are recoverable on its tenants. So there's definitely a reach and an administrative burden argument they're using. In terms of what's happening in England, this is something I'll pick up with Audit Scotland tomorrow. My understanding is the direction that was provided or asked to provide by UK government ministers was to use housing revenue account to top up DHPs rather than debt write-off, but I'll get clarification on that.
I know that these discussions are underway, and I just wanted to, given that the Minister had raised it at the outset, to try and get some clarification around just exactly where you are in terms of those discussions with local authorities, because I think whatever the outcome is from the phone call that you're waiting on, we need to get the money to the local authorities and to help the individuals who are affected. And just, I think it was useful for the committee to know, the position we are in terms of those discussions with individual local authorities, COSLA and whoever else is looking to try and address that problem. So that's been really helpful, Minister, and thanks very much for your time this morning. Thank you. Thanks. I'll suspend again for a few minutes to change over our witnesses. Go then to our next item of business. It's consideration of the Council Tax Reduction Scotland Amendment Regulations 2014 SSI 2014//35. The instrument was considered by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee at its meeting on the 4th of March. That committee did not draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument or any grounds within its remit. But to consider this instrument, we are joined by Jenny Brough, the Team Leader, Local Government Finance and Local Taxation Unit at the Scottish Government. Do members have any questions to ask in relation to the instrument? Ken.
Thanks. Can I just ask, it doesn't seem to say what measurement has been used to operate the regulations by. Is it inflation?
All right. The regulations uprate various components within the Council Tax Reduction Scheme, which include the amounts for deemed living expenses and premium and non-dependent deductions, which are the amount by which contribution is deemed to be made to council tax if there are others in the dwelling who are not dependents. So it's informed by the Schedule of Benefit Rates for 2014-15 that the UK Government published in December. And that schedule sets out those components. And then those components are used to uprate the figures in the Council Tax Reduction Scheme. So it reflects the UK Government's own benefits uprating, if you like. But it applies those figures to the scheme.
So the principle taken is to keep them in line with the same uprating as it would be south of the border across the UK?
When housing benefit and council tax benefit were jointly administered, the benefits uprating was applied. But now there is council tax reduction. Those in receipt who are in receipt of benefits will have those benefits uprated every year by the UK government. Now, if we weren't to similarly uprate the components in the CTR scheme, then that means that someone whose income from benefits is being assessed is deemed to have more income, but their living expenses, the amount they need to live on for council tax reduction purposes, wouldn't be increased. So they would potentially get a lower council tax reduction because they're deemed to have more income, even though that may be just because their benefits have been uprated.
Do you happen to know whether the UK government is using CPI or CMI as its benefit uprater at the moment?
I don't have my schedule with me, but I can certainly follow up that point on their approach for 2014-15 in detail for you, if that'd be helpful.
And just as a matter of interest, do you happen to know, does the Scottish Government have a policy about uprating in line using CMI or CPI as its level of measurement of inflation, of price inflation?
In terms of what's been applied to the regulations here, we've applied, and which is why I will clarify the exact UK government measurements for their components. Where we've taken those components from the UK schedule, we've transposed those, but for non-dependent deductions, we have modelled those on the corresponding increases in housing benefit. There's no direct comparator to the former council tax benefit deduction now in the social security system. But what I can do is write to you and outline the UK government's approach, if that would be helpful.
It's more just to see, are there any other benefits that the Scottish Government uprates, and if so, which measurement of inflation does it use? It's just to see whether they have a consistent policy or whether it varies.
I'm not aware of another comparator to council tax reduction, if you like, because we've only had it for the current year. So there's nothing that would come to mind as a comparator, I'm afraid.
Thanks very much.
I think it may well have been covered, Convener, but just to clarify, perhaps got a bit lost in there. If Jenny could confirm and outline again the effects if we didn't pass this would be to financially disadvantage people who require help with their council tax.
If the uprating wasn't applied, then in calculating council tax reduction for those, as an example, those in receipt of income from a social security benefit, if that was uprated, which it will be under the UK government schedule, they have more income next year from their social security benefit. When that's considered for council tax reduction, there would not be a corresponding increase in their deemed living expenses. So effectively they could be penalised for having more income, if you like, and therefore they could receive a lower council tax reduction award than if an uprating was applied to adjust for their higher rate of income, if you like, from benefits.
Thank you, Convener. Just to confirm that it's crucial for some of the worst off in our society that this is uprated.
Jamie, sorry.
Ms Brobb has clarified the point of if we didn't do this, I suppose people being given with one hand and we'd be taken away with the other. So I think Linda's made the point as well. I do note that 3 members of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee didn't want this to go ahead, but I don't know why that is. But I certainly hope we don't disagree with that position.
Alex.
You don't need to worry, Convener. I'm not going to vote against this or create any trouble. However, I am concerned about the fact that division did take place on the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee when this was considered on a motion suggesting that this was, of course, intra-virus. Now, the fact that that division took place comes as a bit of a surprise. Are there any long-term consequences for this or any subsequent regulations regarding the concerns that were raised in the Delegated Powers Committee?
Prior to the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee's consideration of these regulations, they wrote to the Scottish Government to ask the Scottish Government to explain why these regulations do not relate to any reserved matters in the Scotland Act. It's specifically social security assistance. And the Scottish Government's response, as it has been when the government's been asked previously about the council tax reduction scheme regs, was that they reduce council tax liability, which is within the Scottish Government's competence to provide. They do not provide a payment to meet liability or a subsidy to meet liability. So it is the Scottish Government's firm view that the regulations are within competence. However, we have been asked that question by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee
on other council tax reduction scheme regulations? The answer has always been that they relate to reduction of liability.
Is this an area which we should be concerned about and one that we should look further at to try and eliminate in future discussions?
All I can say is that it is, as has been stated, it is the Scottish Government's firm view that the regulations as relating to reduction in council tax liability are within the competence of the Scottish Parliament.
Just a point of clarification in case colleagues were confused about the line of questioning. Can I just clarify, the Scottish Government, I think it would be odd if the Scottish Government didn't uprate these benefits, but the UK Government, I believe, has moved, my understanding is it's moved from a higher level of inflation, the CPI measure, to CMI as a lower measure. And it's within the Scottish Government's competence, if it wishes to use the higher measure here. So actually, although we're updating them to keep them in line with the UK because of the benefits of having one system across the UK, I believe that's the government's logic in this situation. The Scottish Government could have actually used the traditional method and had a more generous uprating. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, part of the decision underpinning the approach to the regulations is the policy commitment that the Scottish Government and COSLA have to protect entitlement, as would have existed under council tax benefits. So that is the reason for the approach that has been taken, with aligning with the UK Government's uprating, as it is reasonable to assume would have applied if council tax benefit had continued. So that's the rationale behind the decision.
A more generous uprating would have protected entitlement too, would it not?
In terms of using different rates,
a more generous uprating of these would also have protected entitlement.
It would have. I'm afraid I couldn't say for definite what impact using higher rates would have, as it's not something that we considered for this year's policy.
A benefit. I wish the benefit system were in the control of this Parliament. This is a reduction. This is not a benefit, and I think that's probably why the delegated powers and committee got itself into knots. I think that we've got to get that right. This is not a benefit; it is a reduction scheme, which has been put in place to mitigate the slashing of a benefit.
Clarification, Kevin. Annabelle.
Yes, well, I was just going to make that point as well, which I think I made way back when we first considered the regulations. This is clearly not a benefit, because otherwise it would be ultra vires. And as far as I understand it, in bare bones, and from what Jenny has said, so in terms of the calculation, how you calculate the council tax reduction, one side of the equation has been uprated in line with whatever it's been uprated. So the other side of the equation, if you had failed to uprate that, presumably in line with the same, because you've got apples and apples as opposed to apples and pears, then there would have been a negative impact felt, as Linda Fabiani said, by some of the most some of the poorest members of our society. So certainly that's not something I would wish to see. I just wondered, though, who was it in the division in the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee who did vote against? Who voted against? It's not clear what. So there was 4 against, 3 abstentions, 0.
Well, if the information is in the public domain, then I think we should know.
Yes, against Baker, Richard, North East Scotland, McCulloch, Margaret, Central Scotland, Scott, John,
Labour and Tories were against it. Anyway, well, that was their committee, and hopefully the explanations that we've always been privy to in this committee, I don't recall we've asked for any opinion about VERAs. So,
I would assume that given that the issue was devolved to us, then we have to deal with it. We had to bring through the legislation. There may have been some other technical issue which I'm not aware of the discussion, so I can't help any more than Jenny can in clarifying why that division occurred. But we've exhausted the issue, and at least this time when Jenny was in front of us, we did have some questions for her. The last time she was here, we didn't manage to get one question in. But we have to go to the point where we agree to note the regulations. The committee agreed? Agreed. Jenny, thanks very much for coming in. And if you can pass on any information based on the questions you got, that would be helpful if the answers are there for us. So if you could clarify them, that would be useful. Okay, thank you. And as agreed at the start of the meeting, we now move into private session.